Hello, Charlotte Mecklenburg. My name is Meredith Brown. I'll be your host this evening for a special that we're having on workplace bullying and discrimination. Tonight, I'm joined by Dawn Westmoreland, who is an HR expert, human resources expert, a veteran of the Air Force, retired veteran. She's also an author, a podcaster with the podcast called Empowered Whistleblower. She is a public speaker and a life coach. Thank you, Dawn, for being here this evening.
My pleasure, Meredith. Thank you.
Workplace bullying has gotten a lot of attention recently. Tell me, how do you go from being an HR expert to an expert in workplace bullying and discrimination?
Well, I've worked many years in human resources, and when I started to work into the career field of workplace bullying and discrimination was when I was working for a federal agency, and I noticed that there were only 5 black employees out of 500, and I knew something was going on. I used to go to the bathroom and people would follow me, and they knew I had a background in HR, and they would ask me, what's going on? Is this legal? This hiring of family and friends?
So people followed you to the bathroom with these human resources questions.
Yes.
And what did you do from there? I mean, you're a human resources expert. Where did you take it from there?
Well, I knew what was going on is the nepotism was going on, hiring of family and friends, which is illegal in the federal government. And then I realized that some people were being trained while other people were not being trained. And then the person who was trained was moving up with promotion, which that's also prohibited personnel practice. So I spoke up and I reached out to the Office of Special Counsel in Washington, D.C., but I didn't receive any kind of investigation on the matter.
It sounds like you've made some observations that you shared with your colleagues, and now you've shared them with the federal agency. Where does, in there, I sense an underlying current of discrimination here, but when does that really come through? What's the next part of this story?
Well, because nothing happened, I got retaliated against. I had always been a stellar employee. At the time, I wasn't working in human resources. I was working in a different position. And so I received retaliation. I mean, they began the efforts, management, to try to fire me, to harass me, to bully me. And bullying's not illegal in the workplace.
It's not illegal in the workplace?
It's not illegal.
Can you give me some examples of bullying, especially that bullying that's not illegal? Because if you touch somebody, that could be considered assault, but that's not bullying. Can you share with us some examples, please?
Yeah, one example would be supervisors yelling at me, embarrassing me in front of people, or they wouldn't tell me about meetings, and then I would get written up, for not coming to a meeting, or that's kind of like bullying. It's not illegal.
So then what's the difference between bullying and discrimination?
There's a big difference. As I said, bullying is not illegal in the workplace, but discrimination is. And if you go to the resources on this screen, you go to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and you can type in, types of discrimination. I am considered a disabled veteran or disabled employee, and I was denied the right to work from my home. Our job involved the computers, and I could have worked from home like other people, but that was denied, and that opened up a disability discrimination case for me.
If there's any bullying that occurs after the discrimination, it seems like now you're in a protective status. You filed, you're in a protective status. If bullying occurs at that point, is it still bullying, or is it still part of the discrimination package?
Well, let's say if you file a discrimination case and you file with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, for example, then once they accept your case, your claim, then if anything happens, any kind of bullying, they call it retaliation, then that's illegal because you're in a protected status, and that did happen.
Okay. Bullying is not illegal. Discrimination is. If you're filed and then you're in a protective status and they bully, it's considered retaliation. Then who do you file with? You talk about the EEOC, you're an HR expert, but I don't hear you saying that you should file with HR.
Well, it depends. If it's bullying, you have to decide, is it worth it to speak up? I mean, sometimes you just brush it off, let it go. But if it's severe bullying, and again, bullying is not illegal, you can contact your HR, you can contact your management, and I always advise people to send a clarifying email afterwards with the who, what, where, when, why, print it off, keep it objective, and the reason why you print it off is a lot of times emails disappear. I mean, you don't own the IT department, so keep it in a location that's safe.
There must have been a lot of stress on you during this time. Can you share with us it sounds like there's still another part of the journey that you took. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, my whole journey began, as I said, reporting nepotism, hiring a family and friends, and then the harassment ensued. I mean, I was put on administrative leave, which means that I was removed from work for almost 100 days.
Wow.
You know, I had interesting things happening in my personal phone where I would call my loved ones or another person who had spoken out, and it would take 6 times of me calling before, guess what, before they could hear me, and that problem went away later on when I settled. So, you know, a lot of things happened that increased the stress levels, the stalking, the harassment, you know, phone calls. And after a year of it, you know, even though I spent 20 years in the Air Force and I grew up with 7 brothers, you know, there comes a breaking point, and I passed out twice, Meredith, and the second time I passed out, I was ambulanced, and they asked me if I'd like to be admitted to the mental health ward. So I was admitted to the mental health ward, even though I wasn't suicidal, but I had very serious tendencies of victimhood. And it was actually on my mother's birthday, and it was the most embarrassing thing in the world, you know, calling my mother saying, I'm okay, but I'm in the mental health ward.
Right. Well, it sounds like you went from self-bullying of victimhood to becoming a warrior on workplace bullying. That's quite a transformation. From there, talk to me then about the workplace itself. How can leaders know that bullying is going on if they're not the bullies?
Well, they have to engage with their people. I mean, they can't sit behind doors. I've been a manager before, and you have to get out there and you have to engage with your people. You have to know, you have to look for the red flags out there. And if you have a stellar employee that is all of a sudden missing a lot of work, you might want to engage with them to find out, you know, are they okay? Are they happy at work? Because when you see a trend of absenteeism, that's a big sign that somebody might be being bullied, especially if they're not sick or a loved one's ill or sick.
Right. Let's go back to the filing process a minute, because I'm a little hung up on that. I'm a process-oriented person. What about evidence? You mentioned emails and printing off emails. What else? What other kind of evidence can you collect, and who should you turn it over to? Can you just talk a bit, please, around your experience and the advice that you give some others around evidence?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me tell you that when I settled 2 days before my actual formal hearing with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, based off documentation and no witnesses. A lot of times people think they have to have witnesses, but witnesses get scared. They think that they're going to get fired, and that very well could happen. So if you're being, for example, if you're being bullied or you're discriminated, you can send a clarifying email, you know, the who, what, where, when, why, get to the fact, print it off, you know, keep it in safe areas. That way you have it if you have to contest unemployment. You can also, if you're being discriminated, and again, you can go to the different types to look up discrimination. You really can be your own HR expert and look up, because one thing, Meredith, is a lot of times that people think that, you know, if they go to HR, they're just going to get brushed off, you know, because HR is part of management. But the real fact is people give away their power unknowingly because they don't realize oftentimes when they're being bullied, they're also being discriminated.
Can you give us an example of that type of discrimination then? I mean, we've heard your story and the nepotism, but there's, and I know we have the resource slide here, but just another type of discrimination that people may not realize is something that they may be victim of.
Okay, here's a good one, disability discrimination.
Okay.
So somebody that may have disabilities, they may need a reasonable accommodation per the American Disability Act laws.
Right.
And they may need, you know, to work from home if they're able to work from home, or specialized equipment and such, and they're denied that. Or here's another example, age. In most states, if you're 40 or over, and there's variations with each state, if, let's say in the private sector, for example, we'll use that example, is that all of a sudden you're a 40-something-year-old person, you've established, you're earning a really great salary, and then all of a sudden you see younger employees coming in making a minimum wage, and you've always received great outstanding evaluations, appraisals each year,
right.
And then all of a sudden the management's trying to out you out. That could be age discrimination.
Wow, that's not something I've ever thought about, but I can see where that would be the case.
It happens a lot.
Yeah, I can imagine. Tell me then, talking about leaders once again, what do leaders need to do to set the conditions for a workplace-free bullying, discrimination environment?
Well, it's not enough just to have this zero tolerance, because that means nothing. You could have a mission statement, but if you don't walk the talk, then it's meaningless. So if a leader notices that there's issues in the workplace, that leader, that CEO can be held accountable, especially by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
Right.
So they have a legal responsibility. OSHA says that people have the right to work in a safe work environment. They have to engage and they have to know what's going on. They have to communicate not only with the HR people, but also get out there and let the employees know that they're available to talk to. They could set certain times that they're available to talk to.
Right.
They must ensure training is accomplished. They must be proactive, not reactive. And when there's disciplinary problems, then they must take action immediately, documenting the case, either disciplining the person or removing the person, and then also helping to rehabilitate the person who was bullied or discriminated. And that might be by sending them to employee assistant program.
Okay. Now, when I was in the Marine Corps, we had this phrase called walk the deck plates, which means the leader gets up and walks around to check on in this case, they're Marines, and for a leader in the private sector, their employees. Hi, how are you? That helps with the red flags, I would imagine. But you mentioned documentation on the leader side as well. What would you recommend for them with respect to documentation? I understand the email perspective, but is there another way or another format that they should use aside from email to document any red flags that they notice?
Well, one of the things I've noticed all the years in HR, where people get themselves in trouble, leadership, is ensuring that the supervisors are documenting, because the first line supervisor is very aware of what's going on in their workplace. And when they see that somebody is bullying or discriminating, they must be documenting it, writing it up, talking to the person who's doing it, getting his side or her side of the story, the victim's side, and basically compiling a case. And the management must be appraised of what's going on so that management can make a decision on what to do next.
And I assume this is when HR comes in as well to help these leaders and the supervisors with this documentation process.
Absolutely, because HR plays a very, very important role, is making sure that people understand what is civility in the workplace, what's discrimination. It's not enough just to have the online training, because a couple years ago, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission had a task force, and they studied this training. And when people do online training, they find it not to be very effective. So it has to be done, proactive in residence, so people understand what the training is about.
I've taken some of those online classes, and they're not effective. I agree. What if I have a question? Who do I ask my question to? The computer screen? That's not effective.
Yes.
Training, documentation, that's when HR gets involved. It sounds like if you're an employer, that's where you want to focus your efforts, aside from walking around and being engaged with your employees. The employees, we talked about documenting evidence primarily through email and engaging with the person who may be the bully. This is how I feel like you're bullying me. I want you to stop. Include a supervisor on the CC line. Send it. Print it. I just feel like, I know that in your particular case, you were able to settle out of court with documentation. I feel like there should be something more than just printed emails as evidence.
Well, if you can bring a witness forward, but again, witnesses really do get scared. They're also afraid that they're going to get retaliated against, and that does happen often. There are often many bystanders who notice what's going on, and they're just afraid to get involved. So my biggest strategy has always been documenting, because if you document, then you have something permanent, and that's what email trails are about. And so let's say if you were to get fired and you were trying to get unemployment, and the other side, the management's contesting, saying you're a bad employee, and you can show, hey, I filed a Equal Employment Opportunity Commission case, claim, here's emails where I reached out to HR, the supervisor, saying, hey, I'm being harassed, I'm being discriminated, I'm being bullied. I mean, that is proof. Whether or not that person on the other end responds or not,
I see.
you still have proof that you reached out for help, that you reached out and you said, hey, guess what, I filed a EEOC case, of discrimination, for example, and I'm getting retaliated, like I was put on 100 days administrative leave. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. So I remember writing the management and saying, hey, this is retaliation, and I kept quoting, this is illegal, and I would cite the different references.
Right. Well, what about people who don't have access to computer systems at work, a cashier, a heavy equipment operator? Can they handwrite and date what's going on, or what do you advise for them?
Well, a lot of times that's kind of like the old traditional way. People used to say, keep a black book.
Right.
The only thing is, it's a he said, she said, where when you send an email, and that could even be where you go to the library, everybody has access really to a computer. The email trail is proof that you sent an email, and is permanent proof. Whether or not, again, they respond or not, you prove that you reached out to them. And I think it's very important. It's a big strategy I recommend.
Now, social media is everywhere.
Yeah.
It's more prevalent than email. I don't communicate with my son on email. I communicate with him on Twitter. Can social media be used as part of that documentation process?
Well, I tell people be very careful on social media. If you're out there saying, hey, my job is bullying, you could get in trouble. I mean, they could bring in their lawyers. It could be a litigation for slander or libel. So I tell people, get the support team that you need.
Right.
If you need mental health care, don't be afraid to get mental health care. I reached the point of, I was exhausted. I was working 16, 18 hours a day researching, the laws that were broken. I'm not an attorney, but, I well educated, and I spent so much time doing that, I lost my balance. I really did, for over a year.
Workplace warrior. Dawn Westmoreland, workplace warrior. For people who, what sort of personal support network do you recommend for people who don't have that sort of stamina and that type of resilience to keep going when it gets hard? Because it clearly got hard in your case.
It did. I spent a few days in the mental health ward, and it's where I needed to be at the time. I wasn't proud of it. I was really angry. As I said, I was in the metal mirror, having a hate fest, because I thought, oh my gosh, how did you get so weak?
Right.
And, but then I had the aha moment, I was my own worst bully, and checked out. And then I still had almost a year before my hearing, and my paycheck was cut off, and I was living very tight, lost the nice big home, lost everything. But what I really lost, what I was so excited to lose, was the old Dawn Westmoreland, because I started changing, and I realized that I had gone through this journey to learn how to deal with it, to become more resilient, and to help other people. So I'm not the same person I used to be.
And the mental health professionals helped you with that. Was there anybody else in your corner? Friends, obviously, friends can be in your corner. If you have a spouse, that person can be in your corner. Family who are supportive. Obviously, if the workplace colleagues, that could be a bit tricky, because if you ask them to be a witness, they could be intimidated. Now, here's a question. That intimidation of the colleague, could that be part of the consideration for retaliation in that person's case that asked them to be a witness?
Well, if you go to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's website, they'll explain what retaliation is on their website. So witnesses are not supposed to be harassed, but it happens all the time. And then they have to prove, the burden of proof is always on the individual or the witness to show, and then they have to prove the witness, the evidence and stuff within 45 calendar days.
45 calendar days.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like the employer or the person who is bullying and discriminating is still innocent until proven guilty.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, anybody could come forward and say, hey, I'm being bullied, or hey, I'm being discriminated. Right. You've got to show proof. And I'll use, my example is that, I'm considered by the Veteran Affairs a severely disabled veteran. Physically I don't look like it, but inside I have some issues.
Not all wounds are visible.
Yes,
we see that a lot in the military.
Absolutely, we understand. So, I did not receive the reasonable accommodation, although I did all the required paperwork. The doctor said I should be working from home. Other people were working from home, but I was not allowed to work from home.
Okay.
And after the mental health ward experience, I was told to report back to work by a certain day, and I couldn't. I couldn't. It'd become a very hostile work environment. So that was discrimination, and that was also retaliation.
I see. So we went from private conversations in the restroom to a filing with the federal agency of your observations, which is part of what you say on your podcast with respect to empowered whistleblowers. And I understand, too, that you once even interviewed Erin Brockovich on your podcast. Mm-hmm. A lot of notoriety there. So you filed your observations, and then it turned into a discrimination case. And you filed with EEOC, and now the bullying becomes retaliation. So, and I keep repeating the process because I know that there are some viewers out there who are thinking this through as I am, and whether or not they have a case. I don't believe I have a case personally, but it's an important understanding and distinction between bullying and discrimination, and then you add retaliation, and again, there's that 45-day timeline from the time you file the discrimination, or is it the time between your filing and the acceptance of your file?
Well, everything's on the website with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. It'll tell you, because private sector has a certain amount of time frame where the federal government has, a different time frame. And I would highly encourage people to go to their website. It'll explain all the steps and the processes there.
That's good to know.
And then the event, when there's retaliation, which also feels like bullying, it has to be within 45 calendar days of the event that happened.
Calendar days.
So let's say, for example, all of a sudden you're a great employee and they're going to fire you. You have 45 days from that action to provide that documentation. Maybe you get a letter saying, you're a bad boy, you're a bad girl, we're going to fire you, and it's retaliation. You have 45 days to take that letter, write up your proof, what happened, the who, what, where, when, why.
Right.
Usually you have a case manager, you submit it to that person, and you're sure that you get that reported in.
I see, from the event. Okay, thank you. That was... I was trying to figure out, because sometimes a retaliation event can occur more than 45 days after you've filed with the EEOC and then been accepted in a a protected status.
It can happen for years. It can go out years on end until you have your case, reviewed by a formal hearing.
We only have a few minutes left, and I just want to ask you for some key takeaways for. Again, I like to address both sides of the issue. So for the supervisors and the leaders, because not every employer or supervisors bully or discriminates. So just a few brief key takeaways for them, if you would.
Right. It has to be more than just zero tolerance. It has to be that the leader is no nonsense about bullying, discrimination. They will take action. They let that be known. They make sure supervisors are trained how to document. They work very closely with HR. If there's a problem, they take care of the matter. They either remove the person, discipline the person, the perpetrator. They ensure that the victim who's been bullied, harassed, receives the treatment they need. They may need mental health care. They may need employee assistance program. That's very important because they must walk the talk.
Right. Good point. Walk the deck plates, walk the talk. And for the employees themselves, what are your key takeaways from them? I know we talked about documentation, but what else is out there, maybe aside from documentation?
Well, I can think of an example where somebody actually videotaped a bullying situation and they exposed it to the media. I've seen that done several times. But not everybody's up to that. So you have the documentation trail, as I talked about, the email trail, the print it out, keep it in a safe location. Every time you're harassed, retaliated, you make sure you do an email. I don't care if you're doing it 100 times in 100 days. You do that. I mean, I did that, and my success. But I've seen people actually do videos. Hidden videos of them being bullied and actually turned it over to the news, and they had a field day, and because it embarrassed the employer, they went ahead and settled and it fixed the problem.
How is that different than the social media?
Well, social media, you can put things out on social media, but you better be careful too, that you're not violating, slander, liability, you know, because everybody has rights and you have to be able to prove it. So when I see people that get on, especially employees that get on anti-bullying support groups, which I belong to because I usually give guidance and advice, I tell them, you know, it's great to get out there and ask for help and support, but be careful. Don't use your company's name. Don't use names. Just, you can say, I feel violated. I'm exposing this. You know, you need support. Because having a support team is very important, whether it's mental health care, whether it's a pastor, preacher, a religious person, spiritual person, your next door neighbor. It's very important to have support.
I can see where that would be the case, especially if it takes a few years before your case settles or is adjudicated. Looking at your resource slide, can you just go over briefly, please, what you have on your resource slide, and if there's any other resources you could recommend aside from what you have on the slide?
Sure. I have a lot of free resources. I have articles. I write for the Good Men Project, Thrive Global, and some other publications. You'll see that if you go to the article section on the workplacebullyingsupport.com website. I do the Empowered Whistleblower podcast, which that one is about childhood and adult bullying. I bring in all kind of experts and resources and such. All of that is free at no cost to anybody. Now, also, if somebody feels that they're being discriminated, which oftentimes feels like bullying, they can go to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which there's the website. You can look at the types of discrimination so that you understand what discrimination is, because oftentimes discrimination feels like bullying. Again, bullying's not illegal. Discrimination is retaliation, which feels like bullying is illegal.
But the file has to be in the hands of the EEOC around discrimination before you can talk about retaliation.
Right. You can't call it retaliation until you're in a protected status. I mean, you can call it retaliation, but as far as having rights as a protected status, you have to have it in the system filed and approved.
Now, you mentioned OSHA as well, and we have just about a minute left. Can you touch on OSHA? Because I know that's a safety agency. Can they come into this sort of workplace bullying discrimination events? Have you seen that in the past?
Well, you know, for typical discrimination, it goes to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. If it's just, you know, regular bullying, subtle bullying and such, they usually don't get involved. Where OSHA gets involved is usually like workplace violence, because, which could be somebody,
that's completely different.
Totally different. Yes. But they do say that you have the right to work in a safe environment, and that's very important.
That is environment. Very important, excuse me.
Yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen of Charlotte, Mecklenburg, this is Dawn Westmoreland again. She is part of the Empowered Whistleblower podcast, and this was Workplace Bullying and Discrimination Solutions. I am Meredith Brown, and we will see you next time.